A visit by the German Chancellor to Beijing has highlighted one glaring fact above all others. Europe can't make up its mind over what to do about China. There is simply no united position. Last month, European Union leaders held a 3-hour-long conversation in Brussels, with each taking to the floor to express their concern about the dangers of becoming overly reliant on China's money. Yet just weeks later, Olaf Scholz arrived in Beijing with a group of industrialists ready to do business. Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. Europe is struggling to find a single position on China. For many in the West, and especially in Washington, Beijing has grown increasingly belligerent on both the military and economic fronts, and is seen as being uncomfortably close to Moscow. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen diplomatically warned about what she sees as the dangers posed by President Xi's future direction.
The discussion showed that we're witnessing quite an acceleration of trends and tensions. It was very clear from the Congress that we've seen that President Xi is continuing to reinforcing the very assertive and self-reliant course China has taken.
But as Chancellor Scholz has shown with his trip, Chinese money may be even more important than European unity against the rise of China. Joining us to discuss this in North Carolina, Klaus Larres, who is Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In Rome, Michele Geraci, who is an economist, New York University, Shanghai, and former Under-Secretary of State for Commerce at the Italian government. And from Keele, we have Bulent Gokay, who is Professor of International Relations at Keele University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today. If we can start off, Bulent, is there really an issue here, or is this merely a perceived issue?
I don't think there is a real issue right now. For the last 20 years, the German economy has thrived, has grown on its relations with China. And this is an economic fact. But China is considered a systemic rival by the United States administration. But for Germany, it is an indispensable economic partner. In his recent visit to China, Chancellor Olaf Scholz made it very clear that Germany is not interested in decoupling from China. His aim is to avoid any kind of dangerous dependencies, but proceed a sense of proportion and pragmatism. But of course, this is not acceptable for the US administration because there are political as well as economic reasons for pushing the strategy of decoupling with China for the United States. The US government is trying with basic protectionist impulse, started with Trump and now continuing with Biden, to redress a large trade deficit with China. But for Germany, this is not the case. This is definitely not the case. Much of the last 20 years, Germany ran a trade surplus with China. If Germany follows the US policies in relation to China, German economy will be at risk of losing a major driver for its economic growth. So the critics of this position, like German model, is basically trying to impose something upon German government and German economy, which will be against the German interest, direct German interest.
Klaus, if I could bring you in, do you agree with that? Is there an issue here, or is it a perceived issue? Obviously, it would be painful for Germany if it had to abandon one of its largest trade partners globally.
No, there's a real issue here. It is true that Germany is highly dependent on the Chinese market. That depends in particular on vehicles, on machine tools, also the chemical industry. And that dependency makes it so dangerous because we all know that China is not often a fair player in international economics. Ever since 2015, when the industrial plan China 2025 was published, the German government has gradually woken up and has realized that China is busily stealing intellectual property from German companies. You just have to think of the bullet trains, for example, in China, which were originally conceived and designed by Siemens, and now they've been almost entirely taken over by Chinese companies, and Siemens is hardly participating in the building of its own bullet trains. And I could give many other examples. So Germany has a real problem with its high dependency on China that could end up in tears if that continues. And Scholz has rightly said that he wants to diversify the industrial output of Germany and look at other markets, so to make Germany less dependent on China. And we all know that there are serious China problems regarding Taiwan, the South China Sea, now police stations and election interference in Canada. All that is very disconcerting. So I think there is a China problem which the German government has to approach. However, it doesn't mean that they have to adopt the American China policy. There is, of course, something in between. It doesn't need to be an American China policy. It needs to be a European and a German China policy. And the new China strategy, which the German government is about to publish in the spring of 2023, will probably try to find that middle way.
Words and actions, though, here. Klaus, if we're looking at this, yes, Chancellor Scholz has said that he would like to see some kind of diversification, some kind of move away from China, and yet he's only just done a trade mission there, and it has been attempting to look like he's looking to integrate the economies much more closely.
That is true, that of course he has been accused that he is simply pursuing and continuing Merkel's China policy, focusing on the economy and putting all his eggs into the same China basket. Apparently, that is not what he wants to do. He continues talking about diversification. He said, but there's nothing wrong with an economic delegation, with talking to Xi Jinping, of course, and of course trying to obtain a good middle course and trying to obtain good relations with China without, however, making the country so dependent on China as in the past. He's trying to square the circle, and he has had a lot of accusations and antagonism and criticism about that. And I think his critics have a point, and that particularly applies to the Green Party in his own coalition government. However, we will have to see whether Scholz manages to square the circle and manages to develop a new China policy for Germany, which still continues good economic relations, but makes the country much less dependent on the Chinese market than hitherto. And here, of course, the development of markets in Africa, in Latin America, in South America, in the Middle East comes to mind. But that is very difficult because China simply is such a big market.
Michele, how do you feel about this? Do you agree?
I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding. When we talk about reliance on an external partner, we normally refer to the, let's say, the proportion that that partner represents for the economy total exports. But if we are worried about relying too much on one single customer, which is a fair question to ask, we want to diversify our customers, we don't need and we must not decrease the value of trade with that specific customers that we worried about in order to decrease this dependency ratio. What we need to do instead is to increase the value of trade with other partners, because decreasing the ratio from the one you are worried about, yes, does decrease the dependency, but it also kills your overall revenue. It's like if you don't want to depend on air, you just breathe every 3 minutes. That's not a good idea if you don't have a replacement. So there is absolutely nothing wrong in Scholz wanting to establish a strong relationship with China and even increase it. You know, the more you increase it, yes, the more you are dependent if you look at this ratio. But if China then does something that, for example, the demand goes down by a certain percentage point, then you retrench back to the original level. So there is not in itself a big problem to rely or sell more to someone else. The problem is to find alternatives that, of course, do not exist, because China is also the door, and Scholz understands it, to the rest of Asia and Africa. So we are now asking this question. I put it in a different way. Can Germany do without 6 billion customers and only rely on the 700 million of the, let's call it the Western community, the European Union and the US? This was never a yes during the 20 years of Angela Merkel. Now with the Russian crisis, we see that that part of the world is actually getting together closer. So this China leading Asia, BRICS, and Africa is now an even stronger ties. Just a couple of days ago, we had Algeria wanting to join BRICS. Saudi Arabia will join in BRICS, maybe also Argentina. So we have a growing part of the world that is where the economy is shifting to, so you cannot ignore it. But the point, I hope I made it clear, we do not reduce dependency by reducing trade. We reduce dependency by increasing trade with others. So I think Scholz did the right thing. I know very well, because I had a chance to engage with Annalena Baerbock, who's the leader of the Green Party, who is anti-China, but she does not offer an alternative solution. There's no one in the world that can replace 120 billion that Germany sells to China.
Well, that's what they sell. There's also production as well out of China, as China exports to the rest of the world. Let's have a quick look at the size of the problem. We have a graphic here. If we add together total imports and exports between the two, between Germany and various different countries around the world, China is hands down Germany's largest trading partner. We're looking at a figure here of just fractionally under 213 billion US dollars. The number 2 country that does trade with Germany, not a massive surprise, the Netherlands, a country next door, followed by the United States, then France, then Poland. But China is vastly bigger than anyone else. If I could cross to you, Bulent, is there any way that Germany can handle not only the export problem as it tries to sell BMWs and Mercedes cars and Adidas trainers to China, but also for cheaper manufacturing for it?
Well, I agree with the other speakers that yes, it is correct. Try to diversify both the markets and the sources of the imports. But at the moment, first of all, I want to say it's not easy that other markets could absorb German products that Germany is already selling in China because of China's weight in the global GDP. But also, you just asked me about the import items, especially rare earth metals, which are essential to make electric cars, batteries, and also in the chemical industry. So for all these reasons, China is not only as a market, but also source of essential items for German economy. And Germany is trying to diversify its economy, but of course it is not a very easy and very short-term solution. Like if you look at the current situation, for instance, the world's largest chemical products group, BASF, recently decided to downsize permanently its European operations and to move to China and to expand their operations in China. So I mean, I understand the first speaker's point about the intelligence and industrial espionage, but this is happening everywhere in the world. I mean, in the current 21st century globalized world, industrial espionage is a matter of economic life, but not only in China. And so I don't think German government and German companies are that naive and not knowing about this. But still, if you look at the major German companies, they are expanding their operations, not the other way down. I mean, both BASF and Volkswagen. So, I mean, for instance, in the recent years, especially since 2019, the number of Volkswagen sold in China started going down, but still the company is now expanding. It is various operations, including R&D operations in China, because they are trying still to capture the market. And as I said at the beginning, it is not easy. It's not easy that other markets could absorb the German products. And at the moment, the level of industrial production in Germany, which is essential source of German economic strength, are heavily dependent on China. And therefore, I think what Scholz is doing is just continuing the process which started under Angela Merkel. I mean, Merkel visited China 12 times in her 16 years in power. And every time, just like Scholz is doing now, every time took key industrialists, key economic members of the German society alongside with her. So I think this is a continuation of the same policy, even though they are representing this different political parties, but economic interest is basically dictating what needs to be done in the country. And which reminds me what Lord Palmerston, a 19th century British Prime Minister, said once: we have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow. I think probably this explains why Germany is still continuing trading with China and expanding its operations, because this is exactly what German interests, German economic and political interests are asking them to do.
Thank you for that, Bulent. So, Professor Larres, how do you feel about the industrial capacity problem that we have here? Germany is an industrial nation. It has capacity at home, but it has offshored a large amount of that across to China. Other European nations don't have that industrial capacity at home. If Germany can't square the circle, how can anyone else?
No, it's a real dilemma, both for Germany and, of course, for the entire European community, and beyond that, for the United States as well. But let me make 2 points. First of all, I think German industry, the car manufacturers, for example, BASF, the huge chemical giant, they are pursuing their own China policy, which doesn't always please the government. That BASF expands into China and decreases its presence in Germany and in Europe is not pleasing the German government, but they can do very little about. That really has something to do with the greed of industry, the greed of business. They want to make money, they look at the short term, and they really care much less about a strategic long-term policy, which is the task of the government rather than individual industrial companies. And that is a real dilemma for the German government as for any other Western government. Secondly, of course, we are not talking about all products into or from China. Cheap plastic toys, also meat, agricultural products, textile are of course much less contentious than cutting-edge technology. And that is the issue, that China may obtain a strategic advantage both politically, geopolitically, and of course in economic terms. And that is the reason why there is so much concern in the Western world. You know, should we really enable China to develop their own high-cutting semiconductors by delivering them the technology to do so? And here I think that needs to be resolved. And the United States is trying to push back against that, perhaps in a too radical a way. I don't think that the German government shares entirely the American very kind of robust approach, to put it that way. They have a much more benign approach towards China, but they are very well aware of the competition, particularly in cutting-edge technology from China. And also, of course, industrial espionage happens even among Western countries. But we all know that China is particularly active and is particularly unfair in its attempt to obtain Western goods and Western technology, which it has not the ability to develop itself from scratch. And these things need to be approached and resolved. And Scholz has a very unenviable task to do that, because it is highly difficult. It's difficult to square the circle.
Michele, I can see you shaking your head there at that. You disagree?
No, just a point. the cyber espionage, industrial espionage. We do have a narrative that China does more of it and Western countries do it less. But I would ask the expert, I'm not expert, is it that they do less, or is it that they don't tell us and we do know less because we are part of the system? So no one tells us if Germany steals a secret from France or from Italy. We do know that the mobile phone of Angela Merkel was bugged by allies. So perhaps this narrative needs to be correctly emphasized, that people need to be careful when they do business in other countries and even in their own countries. But I would warn against being very lax about competition within the European Union, because we talk about a EU strategy versus China. However, we 27 countries in EU and even the UK, every country in the world competes with each other. There is no economic alliance unless it's a win-win for both. It's one BMW more sold in China is one Stellantis, Fiat, Peugeot car less. Same for one more bottle of French wine, one less bottle of Italian wine. So this idea that the European Union can actually deal with China as a unity is flawed. And it's flawed just like we do not deal with ASEAN when we do business with Vietnam. We do business with Vietnam and then with Thailand, not with the market or Mercosur. We don't go to Mercosur, we go to Brazil. And the same when we go to the US. We don't do what used to be called NAFTA. We don't want Mexico, Canada, and the US to be together. Trade and business is done on a bilateral basis, not by trading blocks or common markets. So there is a conflict. Yes, the interest of Germany may not be aligned with the interest of the European Union, but Scholz is paid by 18 million German people to do the interest of the German people, not the interest of France. So he needs to be careful. It is true, and I agree with the previous speaker, that companies may do activities that depart from the strategy of the government. But let's be careful, because the CEO of BASF was on the plane with Scholz. So if Scholz did not agree on BASF cutting jobs in Germany and investing a new plant in China, maybe he could have not been or should have not been on the plane. So there is a lot of talks and pretending that there is good cop and bad cop, that it's part of the game.
So if I can just cross to Bulent there for a second. Bulent, as we look at this, are we not at risk then of fracturing a united approach from the European Union?
All European Union member governments are following the same route. I mean, as the previous speaker said, they all have slightly different interests with each other. But Germany's position is very, very different, mainly because of the size of German economy and the industrial power of German economy. It is the leading and by far the most significant economic power in Europe, especially in terms of industrial production. But I think I would like to say one more thing, which we haven't mentioned so far, something related to the war in Ukraine. I think, for instance, the war in Ukraine affected the German economy seriously because of the gas coming from Russia stopped coming in the same amount, and not only the German households but also German industry heavily relied on Russian gas for as the energy source. So now their only chance is to be dependent on more expensive liquefied gas, mainly coming from the United States. So this puts a huge pressure on German companies and pushing some of the companies even to the level of bankruptcy. So in this current case, they cannot afford really not to continue their dealings with China in terms of economic cooperation. And that's why, as I mentioned, many leading German companies are expanding their operations, and the government is trying to have a kind of a middle road, a kind of a balanced approach in between those two.
Very quickly, if I can, Klaus, do you think that Germany is going to find itself given the cold shoulder by the rest of Europe?
To some extent, yes, but the rest of Europe will realize that good relations with China, but in a constructive way without being totally dependent on the Chinese market, is the way to go. You cannot forget about the Chinese market. You do have to pursue an independent policy, and Europe as such, possibly in a united and coherent way, has to develop its own China policy. That the Germans have also their own interests at heart, that is pretty obvious, that as has France and Italy and other countries, but it still needs to be a united European way, at least to a large extent. This will be difficult, but I'm optimistic that in the end, a common European approach will develop because they have no other choice. That is the best way to approach China. Individual countries are simply too small and too weak. So the huge EU bloc really needs to stick together.
Professor Larres, thank you very much for that. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.